This is another in the series of interviews on New Jersey governors and their key associates conducted by the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers as part of the governor's program coordinated by the Eagleton Institute. The interview today, which is February 2nd, 2006, will focus on Louis B. Thurston and his relationship with Governor Thomas Kean of New Jersey. Lou, you've given an earlier interview that focused on your relationship with Governor Brendan Byrne, and we're going to sort of continue with this interview and focus more on your relationship with what would become Governor Thomas Kean. Okay. You earlier had served as sort of the chief staff director for the Republicans in the state Senate, then went over and became executive director of the Election Law Enforcement Commission during the Byrne administration. And then you sort of come back into a more partisan role, I guess, toward the end of the 1970s. Could you sort of tell a little bit about your sort of return to a partisan lifestyle?
Well, I was happy to return to a position with the legislature, working on major legislation and being involved in Republican politics at that time, with an eye toward being involved in the election campaign for governor the following year.
So you returned to the legislative staff in 1979, was it?
I believe it was 1980.
1980?
Yeah.
So that was with the idea that you'd be active in the coming campaign for governor.
Right, in the 1981 campaign. And I did participate in that campaign as a senior advisor to Governor Kean's campaign, as well as working on legislation in my position with the state Senate.
And backtracking, you obviously had developed an earlier relationship with him in the legislature and with your role on the staff. Could you talk a little bit about those earlier days in terms of dealing with Tom Kean?
Yes, we had a very good relationship that started when he was Assembly Speaker and I was Executive Director of the State Senate. The Assembly and Senate Republican leadership at that time worked very well together, and so I got to know him that way. I also got to know him in a different role at that time because he and I served as adjunct professors at Rutgers University and teaching courses respectively in legislation and public affairs at Rutgers in the public administration department. And so we had some of the same students and we shared an office together.
Oh, really? Going back again to those earlier days, what was sort of then Speaker Kean's sort of style as a legislative leader?
He had a congenial style. He was quite persuasive with his fellow colleagues in the Assembly, and he was an articulate person on the Assembly floor, and I think he had a good manner of dealing with the governor and the other legislative leaders in the Senate, and so that served him well as an effective leader.
Although your role was in the Senate, did you sort of see him sort of exert more powerful leverage to try to keep his caucus in control?
He worked very much in conjunction with the majority leader, and the two of them together were an effective team to deliver the votes necessary from the majority.
Was it a little bit like a Mutt and Jeff relationship, where one was more the enforcer or the whip in terms of getting people's votes and getting them to toe the party line, and did he play a more sort of a more distant role?
No, I think they were both very actively involved, but Dick DeCourt's style as majority leader was a little more forceful, perhaps, and Tom's was more congenial, but very effective in terms of working with the membership.
Okay. Well, let's then move back again toward the campaign coming up. You probably had other sort of choices, I guess, in terms of what candidate to align with. Did you think significantly about anyone else?
Well, I really wasn't involved in the primary campaign. In my position working with all the Republican senators, some of whom were supporting Kean and others were supporting other candidates, I did not actively participate in the primary campaign. I came on board for the general election campaign for governor.
Okay. And when you did that, did you sort of resign and resign completely, or did you take a leave from your other position?
No, I did not resign. I worked as a part-time advisor to the governor. I did not work full-time and did not have a formal position as campaign director. Other people did those roles.
And what was your role in the campaign?
It was mostly to advise on major policy issues that were coming up in the campaign. I had previously been a research director for Governor Cahill's campaign and spent a lot of my time working on major legislative proposals. So I was familiar with that, and that was how I could best help the campaign.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about the sort of dynamics of that campaign and how the ebb and flow of the sort of public opinion and the political currents worked during that year.
Well, I think that the campaign was obviously one that ended with a very, very narrow victory by Governor Kean over Congressman Florio. But as the campaign went along, the personalities of both candidates came out very much. And interestingly, Governor Kean, who I would describe as a patrician with a common touch, was viewed more and more, I think, favorably by a lot of people who came in contact with him. And Congressman Florio at the time, who had blue-collar roots, was really in some ways viewed more as an elitist, someone who was of the opinion he had certain prescriptions that were going to be used for state government, and I think his personal style versus Kean's turned out in Kean's favor as the campaign went along. That became a factor along with everything else. So when you had an election that was only decided by 1,700 votes.
Now you described, I guess, the contrast between the two of them, mostly in personal style. Was it a campaign that you think was decided mostly on sort of the voter sort of choice on personalities as opposed to issues?
I think that had a lot to do with it. I really think that the personal style and the personalities of the candidates did have a great deal to do with it. In terms of issues, both candidates were very knowledgeable about state issues. Governor Kean, having been Assembly Speaker and longtime member of the legislature, Congressman Florio with his involvement first with the Assembly and then as a congressman. So they were knowledgeable and they came across forcefully with their positions, but the personalities did play a big role.
To the extent that you remember, what issues were sort of debated during the campaign, and what were the sort of contrasting positions of the candidates?
Well, fiscal policy was always a major issue in these elections, and it was the case in this election as well. Governor Kean, I think, came across in many ways as a conservative on fiscal matters who was not interested in raising taxes and that kind of thing. And Governor Florio, I think, came in with a more open view about those kind of issues, and that was a major focus of the campaign.
Now, who were the sort of key players in the Kean campaign?
Well, the governor, in terms of running the day-to-day campaign, the governor had a young campaign team headed by Roger Bodman, who was a 29-year-old individual who had been a campaign coordinator and on the staff of a congressman. and a fellow named Al Fasola was the assistant campaign manager. And behind the scenes, Governor Kean had Tony Ciccatello, who was a longtime friend and advisor, and they were some of the people that played a major role.
Now, to your knowledge, did you think the campaign was run efficiently and effectively?
Yes, I thought it was a good campaign. It was well coordinated, and I think that we were able to enlist virtually all elements of the Republican constituency, and beyond, and most importantly, to reach beyond the Republican constituency to independents and Democrats. In what was the first evidences of Governor Kean's strong feeling of trying to have inclusion, trying to reach out to disparate elements in the society and the electorate to get their support.
And I guess that one objective of the campaign, as you suggested, was to try to confront the sort of possible perception that Governor Kean, from a very wealthy and well-known family in New Jersey, might not have the sort of common touch and sort of understanding of common problems. I know it wasn't your principal role, but do you remember any strategies on how the campaign sought to sort of confront that problem?
Well, I think Governor Kean, like some of his predecessors and successors, tried to improve his speaking style, and did so with some professional assistance, and that was one aspect that was important, and I think there were some dramatic improvements made in that regard, and that was one element in trying to present him that way. There was a famous incident in a primary campaign where the governor took up a bet on a beer in Bayonne, and so he would use those kind of situations to try to show the common touch. But he really did have a common touch.
I guess that resulted from some criticism by the Democrats that he would not be the type of guy you'd have a beer in Bayonne.
I think that was the case.
Something like that.
Yes.
In terms of sort of media strategy, were you involved at all in sort of talking to the media consultants, or was that something apart from
that was not part of my role in the campaign.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about debate preparation? Were you involved in those sort of coaching sessions and preparation of briefings for Governor Kean during that campaign?
No, I wasn't directly involved in that aspect of it as well, although I did contribute information relative to certain issues.
Okay. Now, in terms of the election, and I sort of recall that election night pretty clearly, what was the sort of mood in the Kean sort of campaign headquarters as you waited for the results to come in?
I think there was cautious optimism at that time, and a good degree of confidence. But as the returns kept coming in and it kept getting later and later in the evening, there was real uncertainty as to the outcome of the election. When we finally tried to put it all to bed, and this was well into the early hours of the morning, there was uncertainty, but the numbers seemed to indicate that Governor Kean had a slight lead. I had not planned to stay overnight for that election. I was going to go home that night, but it got so late, it got to be 3 o'clock in the morning, and I had to go find a place to stay, and I tried about 3 or 4 motels before I found a place in Parsippany near the campaign hotel to spend the night. And so we went to bed not knowing what would happen, and the next day, after a reasonable amount of time had elapsed in the morning, I called Governor Kean at his home, and I had prepared, with the assistance of Gary Stein, who later became a counsel and then the Supreme Court justice, a transition document that we were going to use for if we won the election. And I said to the governor, or the candidate at the time, I said, "What should I do with this?" And he said, "Come over to the house and bring it with you." So I spent the next day at the house with him with that document, and we really didn't pay much attention to the document. We were just trying to make sure that victory was his.
Mm-hmm. I think I'll depart a little bit from my role as interviewer to sort of interject my own experience on election night. I was with Governor Byrne at Morven. I believe it was only the two of us watching the returns. We really hadn't expected to have any role during that night since he was leaving office. We were just watching the returns. But as it got later and later and the votes came in, and the one county that had not reported any returns was Camden County, the home county of Congressman Florio. And Governor Byrne became very disturbed about what he felt was at least the image that the county was waiting until it became clear as to how many votes would be needed for Governor Florio to change the election results. And he turned to me and said, "What can we do?" And I had no idea. I was not an expert in election law. I had no idea what powers he might have. And I called the Attorney General's office, and I believe eventually, I think Judy Yaskin was acting Attorney General at that time, because I think the Attorney General was out of the country or something. In any event, she didn't really know either, but then finally got back to us, and she really couldn't give us much advice. But Governor Byrne told me, he said, "Tell the state police to seize the machines and impound them." And I had no idea whether we had any legal authority to do that. I don't think he did.
Right.
But he felt that that was necessary as a step to ensure the public that the election was not going to be stolen. So I remember that very clearly. And and going back again, as I received a call from Ray Bateman from the campaign headquarters saying, and I asked him, I said, "Well, Ray, what do you want us to do?" And he said, "We don't know, but we are worried." And Governor Byrne acted basically on his own.
How about that?
Okay. So anyway, he gets elected, one of the narrowest margins in New Jersey history. And I guess the result was challenged for a while, I guess, in court for a week or two.
It was even longer than that.
Yeah, because I think I recall also that Governor Byrne announced he was going to basically fund 2 transition teams.
Actually did that.
And I believe the Republicans said, "No, you can't do that, that's illegal," but he did it anyway. And I think they funded 2 transition offices, at least until the results were certified. Let's talk a little bit about the transition. You said that you had prepared a transition document. How did that go, and what sort of surprises did you find during the transition?
Well, right after the election, we had to do a 2-track activity because the recount was on for the election. And so a lot of the people who ran the campaign had to devote their time, plus a whole corps of lawyers who were working on the legal aspects of that, to try to ensure that in fact, Governor Kean had won the election. And at the same time, we needed to start the transition process to prepare for him to take office. And he appointed Nick Brady and myself to be co-chairman of the committee to do the transition. And we began our activity in earnest to try to do that aspect while the other folks were doing the recount.
Was it difficult not to be distracted by the legal proceedings in terms of securing the victory in proceeding with the normal duties and tasks of a transition?
We were certainly mindful of what was going on, but at the same time we had a job to do, so we had to really focus our full attention and all of our resources on doing the transition. And we did that. We set up a committee. We had various subcommittees that dealt with various aspects of it, and we proceeded to go ahead full speed with that.
Okay. And talk a little bit about the sort of process of transition, what happens, the mechanics, what's the sort of day-to-day sort of schedule? I assume it's a very hectic period.
It's a very hectic period for a lot of reasons. The principal tasks that are involved are, first of all, dealing with the immediate issues that are before the state government in the legislature and in the executive branch in the period between the election in November and in January, in the middle of January, when the governor takes office. So everybody in the political process looks to the new governor for his opinions about that and his influence and his impact on those issues. So we had to deal with all that. Secondly, you have to prepare for the physical transition of moving into offices and all of that. And the staffing is the major part of it, picking a cabinet of then 20 cabinet members, the staff of the governor's office and other people, so that on January 20th, when you take office, you have in place the things you need physically and from a personnel standpoint to operate the government. Because January 21st, the decisions that you make are as governor are the ones that you have to deal with, and you're the governor.
In a way, though, I guess Governor Kean, as he took office, had an advantage over most governors. He'd been in the legislature, dealt with a lot of the issues that you were dealing now from the perspective of an incoming executive as opposed to from the legislative branch. But he also had this long history of his family being involved in New Jersey from colonial times, knowing most of the government, political, business establishment in the state, probably knowing the types of people that he would like to recruit for his administration, also people he'd just like to talk to for advice about budgeting, fiscal matters, social policy, and the like. So I assume that might have been a significant advantage that he had over other governors who come in without the background and knowledge of New Jersey and the state government.
I think it was a distinct advantage for him to have all of that experience, that relevant experience you mentioned. Plus the fact that over his life, and I came to know this more as I served subsequently as his chief of staff, whenever we had a problem of some significance, he always seemed to know the right person or persons to call upon to get assistance.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that you became his chief of staff. Can you recall sort of when he asked you to become chief of staff, and at what stage in the transition was that?
Well, it was in the middle of the transition in December of that year, and at his home in Livingston, he asked me if I would serve in that position, and I was happy to accept that position. So I was the first person appointed for the new administration, and then worked with him on filling other positions in the governor's office and the cabinet and the sub-cabinet.
Okay. And in terms of filling those positions, again, he knew a lot of people, but I guess there were some new people that sort of sent in their resumes or other people suggested them. How did he go about sort of putting together that team? Was it personal interviews? Did you handle a lot of the interviews and report to him about your impressions? How did he structure sort of that personnel recruitment process?
Well, we had a personnel committee that worked with Nick Brady and myself, headed by Tony Ciccatello. We also had a professional recruitment firm that we brought on board that was headed by a personal friend of the governor's. And the combination of all of us working together conducted the interviews and made recommendations. And typically what we would do would be to interview a number of candidates, getting recommendations from all kinds of people, including legislators, and then narrow it down to one or several people, and then at that point report back to the governor and ask him to meet with one or several people, and then if he, at that point, he would make the final decision.
Now, in shifting from sort of the campaign mode, where you're obviously a little bit more assertive and more partisan in your positions, to following the election and inauguration, did you see sort of any significant change in his policy positions as he sort of took office and knew he was responsible for the state government now and was not on the outside anymore?
I think at that point we were all focusing on the mechanics of getting and the personnel issues of getting people in place and physically taking over the state government. So the focus was there, was not so much on issues other than the kind of day-to-day issues that were being dealt with in the legislature during that transition period. For instance, the governor wanted to raise the salaries of the cabinet officers. That required legislation. We wanted to get that through in the legislative session before he took office. So we had to spend a lot of our time on that kind of issue and other issues at that point. So as a result, the issues related to that he had talked about in the campaign were deferred for later in that first year, and particularly related to the budget, some of the issues there, because we had a budget deficit.
Mm-hmm. Now, talk a little bit about that first year in office. I mean, what do you think were the successes and mistakes of the sort of first year of the Kean administration?
Well, first we faced a $600 million budget deficit for the state budget. And so there was a lot of discussion internally as to how to close that gap. And there were some of the more conservative members of the team that wanted to cut expenditures by $600 million. And then there were some others, including myself, who felt that we should try, while we were trying to hold the line on expenses, we needed to raise revenue, and that ultimately resulted in an increase in taxes to fill that gap. So that was a major focus right there. We also had a railroad strike in the early days of the administration, which people may forget about, but we didn't, and our new Commissioner of Transportation, John Sheridan, had to deal with that. So those were some of the things that happened right at the beginning. One of the other things, a very unusual thing that happened in the first year, was that Governor Kean had a serious medical problem with his back. And this resulted in him having to be hospitalized at St. Barnabas Hospital in Livingston for a period of about 6 weeks. So that we ran the state government out of a hospital bed in Livingston for that time. And I used to go up there every day and meet with the governor and deal with all the issues, and we had to set up communication devices to facilitate that.
Mm-hmm. In your new role as Chief of Staff, what was the most surprising thing to you in terms of running the governor's staff and the governor's office and at the sort of top of the executive ladder?
Well, I had a lot of familiarity with state government, but I think anybody, even someone who has that familiarity, doesn't understand and fully feel it until you get into the governor's office and you really see all the responsibilities that are there. I guess the thing that hit me the most was the crisis management. The fact that every day there was not only one crisis but more than one, and you would set up a list of 18 things that you wanted to do that day, and you might get through the first 3 or 4, and then the crisis would come. And so you would defer those things and deal immediately with the crisis, whatever it might be. It might be a fire, it might be a tragic accident, it might be a state trooper being killed, it might be an explosion someplace. And you had to focus immediately on those kind of issues.
How about the pace of the office? Was that something that was difficult to get used to?
It was a little faster pace than I was used to, and I'm sure Governor Kean was used to. But we adjusted to that, I think, relatively quickly. And any governor coming in has to realize that just how much pressure there is and the fast pace of the office. One aspect of that is every day we'd get about 50 invitations for the governor to go someplace and do something. And all of that had to be dealt with immediately.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about the sort of governor's office team in addition to you and what their responsibilities were and how the office was organized.
Well, that was one of the initial things that we focused on in the transition. And Governor Byrne had an organization in which, and you were a part of it, so you know, in which a large part of the staff focus was on the chief of staff, to whom he gave a significant responsibility, particularly for the political aspects of running the office. Governor Kean had a different vision, I should say, of that organization. And so when we came into office, he decided that he wanted to have 3 people who would be the major focus in the governor's office and divide it that way: a chief of staff, a chief counsel, and a chief of policy and planning. And so when we came into office, that's what we did. And interestingly, while that new mechanism was criticized by some people as not being focused enough, Governor Kean kept that same organization in place through his 8 years in office and was happy with it and satisfied with it. So that was one change that we made, but we felt that worked effectively, and I worked effectively, I think, with Carrie Edwards, who was the chief counsel, and Gary Stein, who was the director of policy and planning at that time.
Okay. Are there other sort of structures of sort of governor's office organization that you think might work better in terms of organization, or is it simply a question, I think, a personal preference of the governor?
It's mostly a personal preference, and if you get the right people in the office, regardless of titles, and they can work together, I think you can effectively carry out the administration. In the latter part of Governor Cahill's administration, way back in the early 70s, he was criticized for his chief counsel, who at that point was the chief staff person, who was viewed as a bottleneck because everything had to go through him, and it slowed the process down a lot. So it's a question of not slowing the process down, but having effective decision-making focus so that you can meet all of the challenges.
Describe a little bit more, I guess, about the divisions of responsibilities. I guess in my experience, the governor's office is one of the more unbureaucratic places in the state government where titles and sort of structures don't mean an awful lot. And people just simply do jobs that they sort of pick up, perhaps when they're not really formally responsible to do them. But what was the division, for example, between the counsel's office and policy and planning?
Well, the initial year, we looked at the biggest change, I guess, was that the counsel's office would have primary and most of the responsibility for dealing with the legislature, whereas in the previous administration, a lot of that or most of that had been with the chief of staff. The chief of staff had the responsibility of running the governor's schedule and coordinating with the cabinet officers, that kind of thing. The chief counsel's primary responsibility was to deal with the legislature on legislation. And the chief of policy and planning was to really deal with new initiatives, new policy initiatives, and work with the cabinet officers on doing that.
And I guess to some extent that goes back to your comments about crisis management, sort of in some cases overwhelming the schedule and the day, that the Office of Policy and Planning was intended to try to have a unit that would be a little bit out of the day-to-day battles of dealing with crises and look a little longer term and have a little bit more opportunity to think about major initiatives.
We felt it was important to have a unit like that that would be insulated from the day-to-day crisis management and to really develop the new initiatives, the things the governor had talked about in his campaign, because 4 years goes by very quickly, and if you don't have some insulation for developing those new ideas, everybody gets caught up in the crisis management, and it doesn't get done.
Okay. And in terms of those major ideas, what were the ones that you thought Governor Kean wanted to accomplish during his time in office?
Well, he had a strong interest in education and education reforms. He had a strong interest in environment. He had been the sponsor of the creation of the Department of Environmental Protection for the state when he was a legislator. And in both of those areas, he felt very strongly that he wanted to have these initiatives carved out. So they were two of the major areas that he really focused on.
Now, in terms of developing the policy and the specifics of legislation, did he have very detailed ideas, or did he essentially say, look, I'd like to strengthen education and let the staff and the cabinet sort of develop the more specific proposals?
Well, I think on education, he had some strong feelings about certain aspects of it. I think he felt that teachers needed to be treated more professionally, needed to be paid better. He had some interest in testing students and improving the basic testing of students, that kind of thing. In other areas of education and in some of the other areas of subject matter, he basically had some general ideas, and the details and bones of that were put together by the staff.
Now, in terms of the environment, you mentioned that his family obviously had, I think, significant influence, and that they were, as a family, one of the larger landowners in New Jersey. Was that sort of a priority of the governor in terms of how New Jersey's development and land policy evolved?
I think that I've always viewed Governor Kean as a traditional conservationist. That was the term that people use for what we now call environmental protection. And so he had a strong interest in land preservation and the things that went with it, and with having development that was more disciplined perhaps than might have been before.
And one of his more controversial proposals was the freshwater wetlands regulatory program. And I assume that created quite a bit of backlash from more traditional Republican conservatives who, again, saw this as a further intrusion of government on the rights of private landowners. Can you sort of describe a little bit about that initiative and the governor's feelings about it?
Well, again, I think his feelings on that go to his longer view as a conservationist, and with his legislation that created the Department of Environmental Protection, he wanted to be able to give that department some muscle to go out there and do something specific about degradation of the land that he saw, and the coastal wetlands legislation was part of what came out of that.
Another environmental area was the Pinelands, which was Governor Burns' sort of major accomplishment in his own reckoning during his time of office. And I believe there was some concern, particularly by Governor Byrne and some of the people who had pushed for the Pinelands program, that there would be weakening subsequently during the Kean administration as the Republicans sort of took office. Do you remember any sort of discussions about that, or any personal conversations between Governors Byrne and Kean about the Pinelands?
I think there was significant pressures at different points from developers and other people interested in trying to use the land, particularly in the Pinelands area and the coastal areas, for new office construction, housing, that kind of thing. And So that pressure was put on a lot of legislators from those areas, and most of those areas, or many of those areas, were dominated by the Republican legislators, and so the governor faced significant pressures that way, and he had to resist those pressures to keep from undoing the good work and protection in the Pinelands, particularly that Governor Byrne had done.
Let's return again to tax policy, which was another area where the more conservative Republicans had a different point of view than you personally and ultimately Governor Kean in terms of how to confront the state's budget problems. Governor Kean did propose a revenue-raising package, and that was defeated. Could you sort of talk a little bit about the politics and the mechanics and sort of the personal reactions to the legislature's rejection of that program?
Well, the governor was obviously torn as to how to meet a budget gap, and he between spending cuts and new revenue initiatives, his advisors were split in regard to how to do that. But ultimately, while some proposals were rejected, ultimately a package was put together for the first budget that included an increase in taxes, which he was not happy about that had to happen, but he subsequently signed that, and it became law, and we moved ahead with those new revenue initiatives, along with attention to trying to hold the line on spending.
Mm-hmm. After sort of getting through that first fiscal crisis, what did you sort of see as the next major items on the Kean agenda?
I think that the governor, after having gotten through that, looked to try to put in place his own initiatives and put his own stamp on his administration, and to really focus on the things that we talked about before, education reforms and environmental concerns. There were transportation concerns and that resulted in a transportation trust fund being created, that kind of thing. So he wanted to focus on his own major initiatives as much as he could.
Mm-hmm. Now, in his dealings with the legislature, it sort of emerged that Speaker Alan Karcher at the time was a very vocal critic of Governor Kean. Could you talk a little bit about their sort of personal and professional relationship?
Assembly Speaker Alan Karcher was a bombastic attorney who was rather controversial in his style and his strong liberal agenda. And a lot of people wondered whether Governor Kean would be able to deal with him effectively. And I think they over time developed a very good relationship, even though they would be critical publicly. Personally, privately, they found common ground. And one of the interesting things was that they found they shared some personal interests. They read some of the same books. They liked seeing some of the same plays.
Do you remember specifically what?
Not specific books, but they were both avid readers. They both had some shared intellectual interests that way, and cultural interests, which I think really helped the relationship and really made it possible for them to get over some of the rough spots in dealing with legislation.
From the staff perspective, did you see Speaker Karcher's sort of criticism as simply political, that it was advancing his personal agenda and possible future campaign against Governor Kean?
Well, I think Alan was a genuine liberal ideologue in many respects, and sincerely believed in programs that he espoused. At the same time, he was not unmindful of advancing his own career, and enjoyed the spotlight. So that all played a part.
How about Governor Kean's sort of relationship with the Republican leadership? Was there any sort of dissension? Was there a general feeling, well, he's our governor and we will sort of follow in line in terms of implementing his agenda?
I think the Republican leadership at that time generally felt comfortable with his leadership and was quite supportive of his programs. He came out of the legislature, and so he was one of theirs, and they supported him.
Again, since he came out of the legislature, did he frequently deal one-on-one with individual legislators as opposed to having the staff as an intermediary?
Yes, he did, but he did not unduly do that. He had so many other pressures and responsibilities, and Kerry Edwards was the lead person, the point person from the governor's office with the legislature, and Kerry had been an assemblyman and was effective in doing that, and effective in working with the not only the Republican but the Democratic members of the legislature. It's important to remind everybody that the legislature was controlled by the Democrats at that time. So Governor Kean was forced to deal with them, and I think he felt that a lot of major things happen in government if you can get both parties to work together.
And despite the fact that he was a former legislator, you don't think that he sort of developed a back channel communication with legislators and made commitments and arrangements with them without sort of keeping the staff, particularly Kerry Edwards, advised of what he was discussing?
There was very good coordination between the governor and his principal staff people in reference to legislation and legislators. But the governor had a lot of personal relationships with legislators that were very helpful, and when it really came down to needing 21 or 41 votes, as the case may be, to get a bill through.
Talk a little bit more about that. I mean, what types of things would a governor say to a legislator to try to swing a vote?
Well, he might remind them that when he was Speaker that he had helped them to get some of their bills through. He might recall other personal experiences that they had together, that kind of thing. He might ask them to do it for the good of the state, that it was something that was needed. So he was not hesitant to pick up the phone or call a legislator in for a personal meeting and try to be persuasive, and generally he was pretty persuasive.
Did it ever get more direct where, for example, a legislator said, well, I have a lawyer friend who wants to be a judge, and if you could come to my point of view that he'd make a good judge, I might change my vote on this bill?
I think that always happens, and while some people don't like to face the reality of it, I think that's part of politics. It's part of what happens in the give and take in the legislative process. And so there were occasions when, yes, a legislator would say, this appointment is important to me or whatever, and those arrangements were made.
And I guess part of the horse trading, and it changed a little bit, I guess, because of change to the Constitution prior to Governor Kean taking office in terms of the governor's action on passed bills, where in the prior administrations, until I believe the Kean administration, the governor essentially, by informal custom, could just simply sit on passed bills for the entire legislative session and not take any action, either signing or vetoing them, which gave the governor quite a bit of leverage over legislators in terms of horse trading on votes on pending bills, saying, well, I have your bill that you've sponsored, and what are you going to do on this bill? And then I'll make my decision on whether to sign your bill or not sign it. Did that mechanics and the change in sort of the system of dealing with passed bills have any influence or weaken the governor's sort of leverage over the legislature in any way?
I don't think it had any real major weakening effect. I think that the governor and his effective team in the governor's office, particularly in the council's office, were really on top of things and they were able to deal with the legislative timetable and the approval of those bills very effectively.
Okay. Now, another, I guess, major initiative of the Kean administration dealt with culture and the arts. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and the governor's sort of personal feelings and background?
Governor Kean has always had a very strong interest in the arts. I recall one particular time when he was meeting with Governor Carey of New York, and we had a meeting scheduled at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, and Carey Edwards and I were accompanying him, and we got there on schedule, and Governor Carey was late. And while we were waiting for Governor Carey, Governor Kean proceeded to educate Carey and myself about opera, which we didn't have much interest in, but we learned quite a bit from him. Governor Kean was a real fan of opera, of other forms of art, and it was demonstrated by his strong support for the arts over his term, and particularly for the project that became the Performing Arts Center in Newark. And I think that's one of his legacies, that wonderful facility was built and has operated successfully.
Mm-hmm. What other sort of recollections do you have during your time as Chief of Staff?
Well, I think my recollections include the fact that I didn't take a day off for the first year I was there. Put tremendous strains on the family. At the time, I had 3 daughters who were ages 8, 11, and 14, and so it was a difficult time in that respect personally, to not spend as much time as I wanted with my family and have to devote the time to the job. It was a fascinating experience in being exposed to all the issues and all the personalities that come through the governor's office. And it was a pleasure working with Governor Kean, who was a very effective executive and a pleasant person to deal with.
And when did you leave as Chief of Staff?
I left in the middle of the next year, so I had been there about 1.5 years. And I moved from there up to be the Chief Operating Officer at the Meadowlands Sports Complex.
And at the sports complex, what were the responsibilities of your position and what were the current issues that you had to deal with?
At that time, I had primary responsibility for the day-to-day administration of the sports complex, reporting directly to the Chief Operating Officer, Bob Mulcahy, who had the full responsibilities and who devoted so much of his time to the external operation of the facility.
What were the sort of major problems facing the authority then?
Well, the authority had just recruited the Devils hockey team from Colorado with the governor's assistance, and subsequently the Jets football team moved over from New York. So we had 2 new professional franchises that joined the Giants there, and we were trying to make improvements in the racetrack, in the arena, and we focused a lot on those issues, dealing with the new franchises and making the physical improvements that we had there.
And then you also had the new sort of Camden Aquarium, I guess, which was built or at least proposed during that time.
That came along a little bit later, and Governor Kean decided that we would have an aquarium in Camden, and he had worked closely with then Mayor Randy Primus from Camden, and he decided that the best way to do this project would be to have the Sports Authority have responsibility for it. So that was what he did, and it wound up that I was asked to head the project, and did that and spent a few days a week for a couple of years going to Camden and putting all that together. and resulted in the opening of the State Aquarium in 1992.
And I guess the aquarium proposal really emerged as the South Jersey part of an original package which would have had a baseball stadium built in the Meadowlands. Isn't that true?
That's part of the consideration. The primary consideration at that time in putting the aquarium in Camden was to help with the revitalization of the city, and in conjunction with Campbell Soup Corporation, which had its headquarters in Camden for over 100 years. And Campbell Soup made certain representations of supporting the city and the state in that revitalization, and if the state would come in and make an investment, as it did, a $50 million investment in Camden.
Another sort of major issue that sort of bridged both the Byrne and Kean administrations was Atlantic City and casino development. I think Governor Kean was sort of viewed as not terribly supportive of the casino development, which had predated his administration. What was your sort of perspective on casinos, both while you were acting as chief of staff and also later with the Sports Authority?
I had not personally been supportive of bringing in casino gambling in the state, and I had brought that personal view, but that wasn't important in terms of the policy for the administration. I think we all, the governor and the people around the governor, didn't have that much knowledge of casino gambling and what was involved in it, and we all learned a lot. I remember then Attorney General Erwin Kimmelman calling me one day and saying, "I want to take a tour of the casinos. Would you like to go with me?" And he and I went down and did a tour of the casinos and learned a lot, and in the process wound up having a meeting with casino executives, including Steve Wynn, who was a fascinating, charming character. We learned a lot, and I think the governor was primarily concerned about the integrity, as Governor Byrne had been, and so it was a learning experience initially.
Do you think Governor Kean sort of changed his views about casinos during his time in office?
Well, I think he, like many people, saw the fact that the casinos were an important economic engine for the state's economy at that time, and could continue to be that, and so they recognized that at that point.
In your role with the Sports Authority, and looking at the broader sort of concept of the Meadowlands, initially, I guess in the 1960s and 70s, being proposed as almost a new city with sort of integrated housing, commercial development, reclaiming the old sort of swamps of the region. Do you think things have gone right or wrong, or sort of a mixed bag since?
Well, I think that reclaiming that land and turning it into a sports complex that was internationally recognized was a really major accomplishment that started out with the Cahill administration, financed by the Byrne administration, and carried through and supported by Kean, attracting 2 new franchises, as I mentioned. Was a major accomplishment for the state, and it brought the state very positive recognition. So I think that aspect of it was a very positive thing.
But I guess the development isn't quite what was envisaged in the original master plan. It's not, at least to this stage, come to be the integrated sort of community that was proposed initially. Do you think there were mistakes made, or was this simply market forces that influenced what would and couldn't happen in the Meadowlands?
Well, I think market forces influenced it some. I think there were some real successes in attracting businesses. Panasonic Corporation, a great international corporation, located its North American headquarters there. Other major corporations did as well. So that was all positive. There were also environmental factors, dealing with very sensitive wetlands issues up there, which were so extensive that it made some of the development very difficult.
Lou, now you're working for an authority, which is sort of a strange entity that's a quasi-autonomous agency that has some accountability to the governor and to the executive, but also has quite a bit of independence. And there's always, I think, been somewhat of a tension between authorities and the people who work for authorities and elected executives. Could you talk a little bit about the sort of tensions or similarities, I guess, in those roles?
I've always been a strong supporter of authorities. So let me start with that perspective. I thought that one of the first authorities in the region, and most important ones, is the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And while it's been criticized and justifiably so in reference to a lot of things, it's performed enormous public service for the region and for the country. So I think an authority like the Sports Authority is a good thing generally. Trying to have accountability where you're not part of the direct structure of state government is a problem, and it can be dealt with in a number of ways. In this case, the Sports Authority's minutes were subject to veto by the governor, which meant that the governor could veto any action of the authority. And in practice, if the governor puts people on the board and in the chief executive roles of the authority who are effective and supportive of his policies and can work with them, I think that you can have accountability. And I think that that was the case there and continues to be the case of a lot of authorities.
Did you, when you were chief of staff in the governor's office, did you have any conflicts with authorities?
Oh, we had conflicts, certainly. We had sometimes authorities which got overly ambitious or got a little bit ahead of the governor in terms of their particular programs, and forgetting that they had to be funded by the governor and the legislature, and that they needed to fit in with the governor's overall policy scheme. Sure, that happened on occasion, but most of the time, because we had people running the authorities that were in sync with the governor, that was not a problem. There was a problem with the Turnpike Authority, for instance, which got out a little too far on a $2 billion expansion plan, and that eventually was dealt with, but they got a little bit too far out.
And of course, as an incoming administration, as Governor Kean's was, following a administration of a different party, it would take some time for you to get real control over the authority boards and possibly to replace the operating people in those authorities. So I assume that in that first year, there was probably a little bit more tension as you, as a Republican administration, came in to inherit authorities that were largely controlled by Democratic boards and Democratic appointees.
Yes, that was definitely the case, and so that is always a problem when you have a change, especially from one party to the other in the governor's office. One of the things that Governor Kean did was to set up a so-called authorities unit of staff people in the governor's counsel's office that would have responsibility to monitor day to day, week to week, what's happening in the authorities and report to the governor, and keep the governor and his chief staff people better informed about that, and try to avoid having the authorities get too far out on something.
Now, you mentioned the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Now, that's a sort of special problem as a bi-state authority, because not only do you have to deal with the New Jersey people, but you have to deal with New York and maybe even more complicated politics on both sides of the river. Do you have any sort of recollections of sort of experiences with the Port Authority in terms of either not following the sort of position of Governor Kean or trying to go off on its own, or possibly playing New York against New Jersey?
There were, I do, because in the first year there were significant discussions about utilizing Port Authority resources and for what kind of projects and in which state. It resulted in a dialogue between the governor of New York and Governor Kean and the chief staff people at the Port Authority, who the executive director of which was Peter Goldmark at the time, and myself and others, in which we wound up creating a fund. This was really Governor Kean's initiative, I believe, that could be used for various projects, particularly at the governor's initiative in each state, a common fund that would be used by both states equally. And so there were serious negotiations that resulted in that, but it ultimately came out that this money from the Port Authority could be used for the good of other transportation and economic development initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Lou, Governor Kean was also known for trying to sort of broaden the base of the Republican Party. The phrase, I think, was the politics of inclusion. That view is somewhat out of fashion today. I wondered if you could sort of comment about the sort of increasing partisanship and divisions, both in national and state politics, and also talk about, is this a good or a bad thing, or is it simply inevitable? I mean, obviously the divisions between the parties are a little bit clearer today than they may have been 30 or 40 years ago, and maybe that's a good thing because it gives a clearer choice to the voters.
I've been dismayed by what I view as a harder partisan political view these days, particularly in Washington and also in Trenton at times. And I don't think it serves the country or the state particularly well to do that. Back in the days when Governor Kean came into office, first of all, we dealt with a democratically controlled legislature. So it was important that we be able to deal effectively with people from the other party. The governor came into office with 3 of his cabinet officers being Democrats. He tried to reach out initially, and he continued that process throughout his term to bring in interested independents and Democrats as well as Republicans into supporting his programs. And I think he was very effective in doing that, and I think that's a good thing to do. I think many major initiatives of government, whether at the state level or national level, can be had by bipartisan cooperation.
Do you think, though, in New Jersey we'll ever get back to that, or is it just sort of idealistic to think that spirit of cooperation can be recovered?
I don't give up hope. I'm optimistic that some of that bipartisan spirit that we had in the past that may be missing at times now can be returned. I would be hopeful that our new governor now and the legislators can get in that spirit and do that, and certainly wish that that would happen in Washington.
Thank you.
Thank you.